Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this HoUSed National Call for Universal Stable Affordable Housing. Sorry for a little bit of a delay in getting started. We will wait one more minute for people to log in. They are logging in fast and furious right now, so I want to give them a minute to do so, and then we'll be back with you. Thank you. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Paul Keeley, the Chief Operating Officer at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I want to welcome you today to today's National HoUSed campaign call for universal, stable, affordable housing. Congress has returned to work here in DC, and President Biden has called on members of Congress to get to work, finalizing negotiations on the Build Back Better Act. NLIC VP for Public Policy, Sarah Sadian, will discuss the latest developments on that front and further actions needed to advance the HoUSed campaign priorities in that Build Back Better Act. She'll be joining us later on the call. Also on today's call, Barbara Poppy, Alexis Kramer, and Tiffany Haynes will share a new brief on child and family homelessness that they authored for the framework for an equitable COVID-19 homelessness response. So we'll get to that. We'll also be sharing lobbying considerations for 501c3s. We've gotten a number of questions on these calls about that. And so Joey Lindstrom on our team will share some information about that topic. We'll get the latest from NLIC's Erase project, including information about emergency rental assistance spending and about federal, state, and local actions still needed to protect renters from eviction. We'll also hear updates from the field and more. So we'll get started now. I just do want to encourage everybody to please use the Q&A box for questions you might have of the panelists and speakers. Please feel free to use the chat box for sharing information with others, for sharing links. We'll share links and so forth, but I'll primarily focus on the Q&A for questions for the presenters, and we'll try to get to all of the questions. If we can't get to all of them, the speakers will try to respond to them in writing or we'll follow up. They are all very valuable to us as they inform what we put together in terms of materials, Q&As, fact sheets, and so forth. So it's great to hear what your questions are. All right, we will go ahead and now get started and to talk about a new brief on child and family homelessness for the framework for an equitable COVID-19 homelessness response are Barbara Poppy, Alexis Kramer, and Tiffany Haynes. I will turn it over to you. Go ahead.
Great, Paul. Thank you, Paul, for the chance to be with you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Barb Poppy, and I'm going to kick off our presentation. We really want to thank you for the chance to share with you an update on some new work that was just released by the Framework for an Equitable COVID-19 Homelessness Response. Our topic today is immediate and flexible crisis options for children and families. Next slide, please. The Equitable Framework member organizations are listed on the screen here, and the work I'm going to describe to you today was a close partnership amongst the National Alliance to End Homelessness and National Innovation Services. Next slide. The report team included Sharon McDonald from the Alliance, but today I'm joined by two other members of our team, Alexis Kramer and Tiffany Haynes, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves right now. Alexis, then Tiffany.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexis Kramer. I am with Freedom from the Streets and No More Streets in the state of Minnesota. I advocate for the homeless community, and I also help families that are dealing with child protection. And I appreciate everyone giving us the opportunity to be here, and I will pass it on to Tiffany.
Hi, my name is Tiffany Haynes, and of course, I'm one of the young people who worked with Barbara and everyone else to develop this brief and prepare for this presentation. I am a single parent mom. I've also had some system involvement. I with foster care, as well as experiencing housing instability when I transitioned out of care, and some other systems. I have I'm naturally born in Jamaica, so I do have experience with immigration, the impacts of that, and being able to seeing how it impact my ability to navigate this system and get services for me and my child.
Thanks, Tiffany and Alexis. So next slide, please. Last year, the framework released two reports. One was an overview of how the pandemic was impacting families with children and included recommendations on ways to better meet the needs of children and their families. And the second was a call to action for local and state governments, organizations, and systems to step up their pandemic response to homeless families. Because what we were seeing were too many communities were planning their pandemic response and resources for single adults and not considering the unique needs of children, parents, and families. So this year we decided to focus on a really critical gap that we uncovered last year, and that was the importance of creating an inclusive and an appropriate crisis response to homeless families with children. The big problem we were seeing is that instead of scaling up or down based on the needs of families, too many families were being left on waiting lists for shelter or turned away altogether because their family configuration was not consistent with the family shelter programs that were available in the community, or there simply wasn't enough space. The consequences, as you can imagine, are quite severe, with families living without shelter in places not meant for human habitation, like cars, tents, and abandoned buildings, which cause adverse outcomes in health, economic, and academic attainment for both parents and children. So what we did is we reached out and interviewed more than 30 leaders across the country to gather information on what was working and what was needed to ensure the availability of flexible crisis options that ensure safe shelter for all children and their families. The brief organizes the findings and recommendations into the 6 areas that are listed here on your slide. First of all, the importance of ensuring capacity to serve all families and strategies to do that. Second, centering equity and culture throughout every element of planning and programming. Thirdly, the ability to utilize hotels, motels, vouchers, and master lease units in ways that are both strategic and effective to meet the unique needs of families. And then the next strategy was how homelessness diversion can be used across the community to help connect families to resources and avoid homelessness. The importance of connecting shelter to rehousing assistance and not leaving families to languish in temporary conditions. And then finally, the importance of embedding homelessness system within the broader community system of services and support. Next slide. We set out to identify programs and community responses that could be replicated to achieve the vision that we held, that no child sleeps outside, and that offered approaches that embrace serving families in settings designed to meet the unique needs of the family. We were able to identify a range of programs and communities, from rural settings to DV, IPV specific programs, to community systems, to culturally specific programs. The 9 spotlights featured in this report are Asian Americans for Community Involvement in San Jose, California, Cleveland Cuyahoga Continuum of Care and the Office of Homeless Services, the District of Columbia's Department of Human Services and Interagency Council on Homelessness, Family Gateway in Dallas, Texas, the Greater Richmond Continuum of Care Homeward in Virginia, Hope Atlanta serving Metro Atlanta, Georgia, Mahub Atwa Community Action Partnership, which is operating in rural Minnesota, Mother Nation based out of Seattle, but serving Native relatives across the state of Washington, and Rainbow Services based in Los Angeles, California. I'm going to now turn it over to Tiffany, and if we can advance to the next slide, that would be great.
So I'm going to start with a few of our recommendations developed based on our brief and findings. The first one is to build equity into policy and funding decisions and decision-making practices. So an example would be how fair housing, this is just examples, but an example would be how fair housing is currently interpreted as equal, but when addressing racial and economic disparities, equality isn't enough because of the generations of inequality and inequity. So considering changing how fair is being interpreted to equity, so that we can start to transform so that people aren't drastically impacted or disparately impacted. The next one, recognize and dismantle punitive system and program policies that impede and police Black families and other families of color. An example, a minor example, is shelter hours, like closing it off for people after a certain time, or things like that. Another is increased flexible funding to meet the unique and self-defined needs of all families with children who experience homelessness. Example is immigrant families may not have access to federal funds, so being creative and thoughtful about that. And this isn't just speaking to undocumented immigrants. This is also speaking to people who may have recently attained their immigration status and not being able to access things like Medicaid because of federal requirements. And then the next one is ensure policy and funding supports housing first approaches that are inclusive, holistic, and trauma-informed, understanding that most people who have system involvement do have experienced a certain level of trauma. So making sure that, the services are centered around, understanding that trauma, but then also like a healing centered approach so people can actually, be thrive and not just survive in the space. The next thing is ensure all funding and policies are accountable for meeting each family's needs. Example of people transitioning from out of systems, so not transitioning them into a homelessness situation or a foreseeably unstable housing situation would be my example of what that would look like. Next slide, please. All righty, so the next thing is systemic actions that require persistent advocacy for children and families. But the next set of recommendations is stop criminalizing and policing the activities of Black and Brown people. An example, many examples, so I'm not gonna get stuck on trying to give you an example. Eradicating barriers to assistance for immigrant and undocumented family members. I think my example earlier kind of alluded to, the funding thing. Federal funds are not accessible to undocumented immigrants. So being mindful of that when we're thinking about how to rehouse, or because most people who do have families and there may be immigrant members of that family, we need to make sure that we're not following through with the practice of separating families or not, helping certain members, because that sets the whole family back. Increasing the supply of deeply affordable rental housing, expand rental assistance access, and remove barriers to safe and stable housing. An example is voucher programs. Although in some places it's illegal to discriminate on source of income or source of payment, it still happens because people can just refuse to house people, period. So setting some kind of accountability measure would be very helpful. And then also just raising awareness, because you can put all of this money into a program, and if no one knows, then it's going to appear that there isn't a need when we know that that isn't true. Support policies that raise families' incomes and promote economic stability. Inflation is going to happen. Staying stagnant and not, raising income to the need. Like right now in Virginia, I believe it takes at least $24 an hour to be able to afford paying for rent and your other things and not being rent burdened. But realistically, most jobs, you don't get paid that amount. So making sure that we're being mindful of that, because if not, then more monies is just going to be required to go into those emergency and welfare systems if we're not putting it into people being able to access affordable and sustainable employment. Another barrier would be childcare. We did have some recent policies because of COVID, but as we all know, a lot of those policies and funding opportunities or funding pools that became available, they were been needed. So they were only made urgent because of COVID and the crisis. But now that a lot of those have ended, I'm sure that many families are experiencing a high level of crisis or anxiety when it comes to figuring it out from that point. Expand capacity of community and public social service programs for families experiencing housing crisis to avoid eviction, housing loss, and homelessness. So a lot of times people just, even though it's true that one payment, we know that one payment can be very helpful and could prevent something that could be more detrimental. And to be quite frank, an eviction on your record is almost like having a criminal record in housing, like not being able to be housed because something has stained your record, and housing is a basic need. So I do feel like that it doesn't make sense to have something like that would further essentially criminalize people, for being poor. And so, yeah, I think that's it.
Alexis, did you want to jump in and add some of your thoughts?
I guess one thing I would like to say is I really appreciate the slide because I have lived experience of being homeless, and I have lived experience of dealing with child protection, but I actually never, actually experienced being homeless with my two children. So I really appreciate the fact that, we're talking about these ideas and trying to figure out ways on how we can help other families from, getting the services and stuff that they need to, become stable going forward. I especially like the first one. I mean, to me, stop criminalizing and policing the activities of Black and brown people. I think that's very important because it's happening all over the nation. It's happening everywhere, where there's a lot of different practices that are biased towards people of color. And I'm hoping that together we can find ways to diminish that and actually start working together rather than fighting against each other. In terms of the other ones, I can't really think of anything, but I think Tiffany did a great point at mentioning of, the examples for all the rest of them.
Alexis, I really appreciate what you just said. and especially about I'm so sorry, my Alexa speaks every time I speak to Alexis. But but I really appreciate what you said about the child welfare piece, because like you, I've had experience with child welfare, and I mean, not child welfare, it's child protective services, because I've had experiences with them as well. And I know when I transitioned out of the system at the brink of being homeless, I could not disclose that I was unstably housed to my transition worker from foster care, because had I done that, they would have taken my child, and so because we have practices that penalize families, Black and brown families, for being poor or for just being Black, it's hard for people, and even immigrant families, like some of the most marginalized LGBTQ people, when we have policies that criminalize people for being poor or just because of their identity, it makes it hard for people to reach out for services and get the help that they need because of fear of punitive responses, rather than something that's actually going to be helpful and restorative. And so I really appreciate Alexis being adamant about bringing that to life, because for me, I experienced unstable housing, couch surfing, sleeping on the floor with my child. And I also had to be mindful and, protective over that, because if the wrong person knew, then I would have been separated from my child again. And that shouldn't have been a concern. My concern should have just been finding stable housing and all of the other needs for me and my child.
Great. Well, thank you, Tiffany, as well, for all of your thoughts and contributions to this. And next slide, I know we got a lot of content here. So if you want to get a copy of the report, the link is here. If you want to hear more from Tiffany and Alexis, these two brief videos really were their chance as well to kind of add some details to their thoughts and such. So I really encourage you to do that. And then if you'll watch, we're going to do a full webinar on this report sometime during November, because we really are committed to helping communities have new ways to ensure that no child sleeps outside, and to think about not just capacity, but think about the design issues that Alexis and Tiffany were just talking about, because too often those policies and practices are in place that exclude and harm families. So thank you for the time today. We hope you'll find our work to be useful in your community.
Well, thank you, Barb, Alexis, and Tiffany. It's so funny about the Alexa turning on every time you say Alexis. I've never seen that happen before. It doesn't look like we have questions in the Q&A box right now. I will chime in with the words that BJ Jones shared in the chat, which was great presentation. Thank you so much for all this fantastic work, and we've shared links, and we'll keep a lookout for the webinar that you're going to be conducting. So thank you so much for joining us today. Appreciate it. Take care. Okay, we'll move on in our agenda to the next item, and that is Kathy Alderman, Chief Communications and Public Policy Officer at the NLIHC State Partner Colorado Coalition for the Homelessness, for the Homeless. Kathy, take it away.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. And coming on the heels of a conversation about policing people for living in poverty and for their actions, I want to tell you about a very dangerous and deceptively worded measure that we're facing here in Denver for the November 2nd election. I say deceptively worded because the title is Homelessness, Compassion, and Safety, when in fact the measure is not any of those things. It would require that after somebody contacts the city of Denver, if they have not moved a homeless encampment that was being complained about within 72 hours, then the city would be civilly liable to that individual. We currently in Denver have a camping ban that has been unproductive in resolving homelessness, as we all know, because camping bans certainly do nothing to resolve homelessness. And this would increase that enforcement and require the city to be civilly liable to individuals when they can't respond in time. This, despite the fact that Denver is under a federal court order to provide at least 1 week's notice prior to moving any encampment. And so this is in direct conflict with that federal court order. It would also be extremely expensive for the city to engage in these activities, as well as potentially illegal, meaning that city resources would be tied up in litigation and dollars would be misspent in terms of resolving homelessness. The second provision of this measure is that and this is where it's really a wolf in sheep's clothing, is that it says it intends to provide safe spaces for people by setting up safe outdoor spaces, up to 4 of them. However, in Denver currently, we have 2 safe outdoor spaces, and they were very difficult to site, and they require intensive resources, including access to restrooms and trash pickup, as well as a location in which to site these places. And there are no resources tied to this measure to ensure that these safe outdoor spaces could be set up. And so on the one hand, the measure is saying we must move all people experiencing homelessness from our site. And we think safe outdoor spaces are a good idea, but we're not going to provide any of the infrastructure or resources to set that up. Unfortunately, because of the increased camping that we're seeing in the unsheltered population of people experiencing homelessness in Denver, we have a lot of concerns that this could pass. And as I mentioned before, there is no reason to think that it will do anything to resolve homelessness. It will just move people from place to place and create more of what our previous speakers were just talking about, that us versus them mentality. And the city has already filed a lawsuit against the measure, and we're talking to partners who are also interested in filing a lawsuit against the measure if it were to pass. But this is also being pursued in an environment where we're seeing another very NIMBY-driven initiative to repeal our group living ordinance, which was changed just this spring to allow for more roommates to live together, to allow for more consistent siting of places for people to transition out of the criminal justice system and for shelters. And so these things are really kind of coming to a head in a high-priced housing market in Denver, where we are seeing the more people enter the cycle of homelessness, and now we're beginning to restrict both options for people to obtain affordable housing, as well as to safely be outside without the threat of their neighbors and the police. So we're hoping that this is not going to be a trend that we'll start seeing across the country, but unfortunately, people often do test out measures on the Colorado ballot and city ballots within the state of Colorado, because it is easy to access our ballot. And so we wanted to bring it to your attention just so that you would be aware in case you start to see something like this in your local area. And please feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and we'll be reporting out results of this election maybe on our next call. But appreciate folks' time, and please do reach out with any questions.
Thank you so much for that, Kathy. I'm going to use a question from Jerry Pohe and add a piece of my own, which is, his question is, why is this proposal happening at this time? Who's behind the effort? And then if you could also maybe comment about how are you and others trying to mobilize against it?
Sure. So the actual person that filed this initiative is the head of the Republican Party for Denver. He is responsible for a couple of other initiatives on our ballot this cycle, including the reduction of sales tax, which is one of the main funding sources for homelessness resolution services in Denver. So again, this is really deceptively worded. And when you hear him speak, he'll say, I don't have anything against people experiencing homelessness. I just want them in these safe outdoor spaces, of which I'm not willing to provide any resources, funding, or locations for. And this civil enforcement of the Denver's camping ban is really dangerous and kind of in line with, if you follow anything in reproductive health care, the very stringent and strange abortion law in Texas, which allows civil enforcement. We're seeing more and more moves into this direction, which I think is, again, it really creates an us versus them environment, which could be very dangerous, especially for people that are forced to sleep outside. And the second question was?
And what are you guys and others doing to mobilize against it?
Sure. So there is a coalition that is formed to oppose it. It's called Denver Do Our Best, and it's No on Initiative 303. Just this morning, we released a press release and a statement against the initiative, which we'll be sharing on social media and other places. We also released at the end of last week our ballot guide, which hit about 20,000 inboxes and is available on our website, encouraging people to vote no. Again, we're kind of in a position where we are scrambling a bit to get the information out there, because ballots for the state of Colorado are beginning to hit mailboxes just this week, and we have an all mail ballot election cycle, so people can start sending those ballots in pretty soon. And tensions are high in the city of Denver. Again, we have a very high percentage of people that are sleeping outside. It's more visible now than it's ever been, and people are frustrated and believe that the city's not doing enough. But even if this measure were to pass, it certainly doesn't mean that there would be any more resolution, any more resources, or any resolving of what we're seeing outside. That's only going to come from the provision of housing and resources and shelter.
Sheila White asks how many people have become homeless due to the lifting of the eviction moratorium. Do you have any sense for that in your area?
I think it's a great question, and I don't think we know yet, because that moratorium was lifted just about a week ago. And we know that rental assistance dollars are getting into the hands of more people who need them now than they were prior. But we've certainly seen an increase in eviction filings, and I believe that unfortunately the month of November is really going to be telling for that.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kathy. There is a lot of chatter in the chat box. If you have a few minutes, I know you have to get off the call shortly, but you might want to take a look at the various comments and questions that have come in. Great presentation. Thank you so much for sharing this. And we've put links to the resolution, the campaign, Let's Do Our Best campaign, and so forth. So you can take a look at all the chat that's going on in there.
Great.
Thank you so much for joining us, Kathy. Take care. Okay, we will move on to our next field update, and I will invite Kashana Hill, Executive Director of the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, to join us. Kashana?
Thank you, Paul, and thanks to everyone at LIHC for having me. I'm really excited to be here and speak with y'all. So I'm going to chat a little bit today, we can go to the next slide, please, about a report that the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, we call ourselves LAFAC, that's LAFHAC. So LAFAC released a report on how neighborhood associations are wielding political power in New Orleans to block the development of affordable housing units. And we really created this for our local work, but we hope that it can be a model or inspire similar reports in communities across the country. And so I'm going to chat a little bit about the background and the context for the report, and then also the methods that we use to collect this information. I just wanted to say that it feels important to share here because we know that systemic racism and discriminatory housing policy act as barriers to low-income folks having access to universal, stable, affordable housing. And so this report came about as the result of a prior success that we had at the Fair Housing Action Center, where we had been working to convince the new, at that time, housing authority director in New Orleans not to sell off scatter site properties. The housing authority had a plan to sell off scatter site properties. And as communities have continued to gentrify and Black New Orleanians have continued to be displaced after Hurricane Katrina, now many of the vacant lots that the housing authority owns are on lands in well-resourced communities. And so the housing authority decided not to, after a multi-year advocacy campaign, they decided not to sell off the scatter sites and instead want to redevelop those lands and build affordable units in well-resourced neighborhoods. And they are continuing to run into NIMBYism, not in my backyard sentiment, with every single one of those proposed developments. Next slide, please. So there are some opponents who have continued to use racially coded language in their opposition, but rather than continuing to fight the NIMBY fight, project by project, we wanted to be fully clear about the problematic systems and dynamics that are at play within our local land use and zoning decision-making processes. And so we also wanted to make sure to release this report before New Orleans' next municipal elections, which are going to take place in November, because as may be the case in many of your communities, we've continued to watch local elected officials really bend over backwards to appease these NIMBY groups. And so the report documents a few key findings, that neighborhood groups are not actually racially representative of the neighborhoods or communities that they claim to represent. It turns out these neighborhood groups are afforded disproportionate weight in local land use debates by elected officials and disproportionate coverage in the local press. The report also documents how these groups use coded racism to oppose affordable housing. And we also specifically wanted to be very clear to quantify how many units in New Orleans have been delayed or denied because of this race-based NIMBY opposition. And then we also made policy recommendations about how we can change things moving forward. So please go to the next slide. So we were able to show that neighborhood associations are mostly wealthier white homeowners and therefore don't deserve the outsized voice that they get in our majority Black, majority renter, majority working class city. And I also just wanted to say that we know that each city has like different neighborhood engagement systems, but whether it's community boards, zoning boards, neighborhood groups, or whoever wields this power in your community, there is potentially an opportunity to show that these groups are out of touch, they don't really represent the voice of the community, and they may be unrepresentative of the demographics of the community. Next slide, please. So we were able to, just real quick about methodology, we were able to find the names of over 800 neighborhood association board members. And then we used resources like voterrecords.com to confirm their race and address. Once we were able to confirm their race and address through publicly available information, we were able to go to our tax assessor's website and look up whether those specific neighborhood association members owned their home or were renters. And then we worked with a local student who administered a survey to neighborhood association board members and received almost 200 responses. So the report is obviously focused on neighborhood groups and NIMBYism. And in New Orleans, we looked at which neighborhood associations were the most active based on the number of meetings and calls to action that they put out. And we compared them against their demographics. And not surprisingly, the most active neighborhood association groups were typically those that were the whitest. We also looked at these groups' engagement in other land use battles. And so two in particular, in addition to the development of affordable housing, the two land use battles that we studied as they related to the demographics of neighborhood associations were a revamp of New Orleans' comprehensive zoning ordinance, as well as a fight here locally over how to regulate short-term rentals. And the upshot of all that is that it was very clear that the white neighborhoods were shaping the policies around the comprehensive zoning ordinance and short-term rental regulations, because some of the whitest and wealthiest neighborhoods in the city, many of you may be familiar with the French Quarter here in New Orleans, people do actually live there, and it's an incredibly expensive neighborhood to live in. But communities like the French Quarter, which are generally whiter and wealthier than the city as a whole, they were able to get total bans on short-term rentals put in place. But historic Black neighborhoods that are adjacent to the French Quarter that had even more short-term rentals were not even considered for bans. And so we are thinking that that lack of, right, like a ban on short-term rentals really has to do with the lack of political power afforded to the neighborhood associations as they are less and less white. So we documented some of the coded racist opposition, as well as city officials trying to appease not in my backyard sentiment. And we made the connection between the racist NIMBYism and lost affordable units, especially in well-resourced and higher opportunity neighborhoods. Continue to the next slide, please. So as you'll see, all in all, New Orleans is missing a little over 600 affordable homes as a result of not in my backyard sentiment. And continuing on to the next slide, you'll see here the recommendations that we included in the report, which include things like stripping neighborhood groups of notices that they receive about zoning change and developments that are proposed unless they report their demographics to the city, developing an advisory committee of people living in subsidized affordable housing or people who are on wait lists for affordable housing, building a new inclusive community engagement infrastructure are all recommendations that we included in the report. So I'm going to stop there in case there are questions, and I'm happy to share more as the need arises.
Fantastic, Shoshana. Thank you so much. I do have a couple of questions. One is just, can you help this individual, Ann Gunther, ask the question by defining coded racism?
Yeah, so I think if we went back to the slide that was 2 slides before, you'll see the kinds of comments, right, that people were making. The middle comment here on this slide, I'll just give a little background there. So a local homeowner who lives in a former plantation home in a neighborhood that is right now in the middle of a fight about a proposed mixed income development. And this is a person who also was in a leadership position at Tulane University here locally. He wrote an op-ed in a local publication here in 2019, suggesting that the development would be an isolating ghetto. There have also been questions, you know, at public forums about whether there will be prison guards. That's a direct quote. At a proposed affordable housing development, there are very often comments made about quote unquote prostitution and crime that will come to these communities as a result of affordable units being built in those neighborhoods. So this is the kind of coded language that you know, we've been hearing throughout this process as we work to support the Housing Authority and trying to bring affordable units to these communities. And I did want to just note that, yeah, you know, there's a comment that saying ghetto in an op-ed seems explicitly racist. So, you know, you all can be the judge about whether these comments are coded or not. But I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this kind of language from your own communities, unfortunately.
Great, Shoshana. Another question, part of a question from Jerry. Do you have coalitions of the needy to fuel your advocacy? In other words, you know, are you engaging, you know, extremely low income residents in some way to help with your advocacy push?
Yeah, so the Fair Housing Action Center has been around since 1995, and the work that we do is deeply built, right, and based on the needs of community. And so we are a direct services organization in addition to doing policy advocacy. So we provide free legal representation to people who have experienced housing discrimination, as well as to people who are facing eviction in the New Orleans area and in the Lafayette area, which is a city about 2 hours west of New Orleans for folks who aren't familiar. So we are deeply rooted in community in South Louisiana, in Southeast Louisiana. And so the needs of community and conversations with community members absolutely inform, you know, all aspects of our work, for sure.
Outstanding. Well, there's a lot of conversation going on in the chat. I'll ask you to take a look at, Shoshana. You generated a lot of interest. So thank you so much for this presentation. Really
Yeah,
appreciate
and thank you for having me. And if I could just say that people can check out the whole report at lafairhousing.org. You'll be able to find the report. And I'm happy to speak with anyone offline or answer any questions offline that folks might have. And I can share my email address in the chat if that's helpful.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Kashana.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on in our agenda. And now we have Veronica Beatty from California Coalition for Rural Housing joining us. Veronica, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thanks, Paul.
Great, take it away.
So I'm going to give a brief update on what's been going on in California around wildfire and affordable housing. As I'm sure you're all aware, California is facing multiple growing climate worsened natural disaster risks, extreme heat, flooding, and of course, what makes the headlines is the wildfires. In just the past few years, we've had set records and then broken them and then set them again in terms of acres burned, structures destroyed, people evacuated, and overall cost. Under current estimates, more than 1 in 12 California homes is located in an area with high risk of burning in a wildfire event. Even that's probably an underestimate. And that includes 140,000 units of affordable rental housing that's in that wildland urban interface zone vulnerable to fire. In 19 of our counties, 100% of our affordable housing is located in those at-risk areas. And in addition to those potential losses, we're already seeing disasters having a multiplier effect on our existing crisis. So we see damage and destruction of our limited affordable housing stock. We see our homelessness being driven up, particularly in rural areas, by these natural disaster events. We're also seeing the way that newly created demand for housing is driving up housing costs, increasing the need for affordable homes, and creating secondary displacement as there is a shortage of both market rate and affordable housing. And for our developers who are our members, that turns into increasing costs, particularly insurance costs, and also around construction materials, resilient building materials for both initial construction and in retrofitting. But kind of on the bright side, if there can be said to be one, we're also seeing some folks kind of start to get the picture that affordable housing is key in all stages of the disaster recovery process. So we're starting to have more conversations about where we should site housing, given that we want to mitigate risk, but also then the need for having a nuanced conversation that doesn't let wealthier communities use wildfire risk as an excuse to not build their fair share of housing. We're talking about what changes in construction techniques new affordable housing development should incorporate and how to fund it. During disasters, and this has come to light particularly with COVID, the key role of affordable housing developers as community partners, folks who already have the technical capacity in place, the partnerships in place, oftentimes even more so than some of the smaller rural governments we serve, that can make them key players in disaster response. So we've had folks who have redesigned their community management techniques to make sure that their community spaces can be used as cooling centers in the event of extreme heat, as water distribution centers, testing centers, and even temporary shelter in the case of evacuation from a wildfire. And finally, we're thinking, as we rebuild communities that have been affected by fire, how do we make sure housing for the most vulnerable is built back first, or at least contemporaneously with market rate housing? So to further these conversations, the California Coalition for Rural Housing recently released a manual on disaster planning, preparedness, and rebuilding, targeted to rural affordable housing developers serving low-income families and communities of color across the state, and also to disaster planning professionals. So sort of for the housers, what's a good 101 on what you need to know about disaster planning, and for disaster planners, what do you need to know about affordable housing? This guidebook includes case studies on our members' responses. And we talk a lot about fire, of course, but we also address responses to drought, flooding, mudslides, extreme heat, and COVID, as I mentioned. So some of that looks at creation of disaster-focused staff positions, building preemptive partnerships with organizations like United Way and the Red Cross. Some of those efficiencies around building design, construction, and siting. My favorite example is one of our developers has their entire apartment complex built up on podiums to mitigate flood risk, and there's actually evacuation boats built in beneath the building, which is something that may be super common for our friends in Louisiana. I'm not sure, but it was kind of novel in California. So that manual is available on our website. I'm going to drop it into the chat. And I want to mention as well that we have been attempting to run a bill for a couple years now, and we'll be doing so again, to create a statewide bridge loan fund that would allow California to rapidly deploy recovery funding, because federal rebuilding funds are often tremendously delayed. So we're looking to create a bridge loan fund that would allow us to get community development block grant disaster recovery funding out more quickly. That may sound familiar to any partners we have on the call in New Jersey. We're using your program as a model. So if you've been having problems with it, please let us know. Or if it's the best thing since sliced bread, tell us that too. And finally, we have our annual conference coming up where we'll be talking about disaster issues among other topics. I'm going to put the registration in the chat. And close by saying, if any of you are also working kind of at this intersection of natural disasters and housing, please reach out. I am happy to connect in the chat now or offline later. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. Situation in California with wildfires is something, unfortunately, I think we're going to be dealing with for many years to come. This resource is phenomenal. NLIC is a big supporter, and you guys are an incredibly important member of our Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. This resource will be shared widely, and really encourage everybody, because disasters are happening around the country, to take a look at it. I don't think we have any other questions. There's a comment from Jerry. Justice, equity, and compassion towards fire-ravaged communities in California should inform all Building Back Better communities confronting climate change disasters. Grateful for your leadership. So thank you. I echo Jerry's sentiments there. Thank you so much for this report and for all you've done.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to call a little bit of an audible here. Sarah Sadian, VP for Public Policy at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, is going to go next because she has to jump off the call to deal with another matter. And so I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to talk a little bit about the Build Back Better package and what else we need to be doing as advocates. Sarah?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Paul. And I appreciate everybody's flexibility with us moving the schedule around. This week, Congress is back in session, and Democrats have just 2 weeks in order to meet their self-imposed deadline of October 31st to get the Build Back Better Act, that reconciliation bill, and their bipartisan bill passed. And that seems less and less likely. And so we are preparing ourselves that that deadline would get moved back some. Progressives and moderates still don't agree on the overall size of the package or the shape of it, what will be included and what won't. And we're seeing more and more members of Congress, the White House, outside organizations expressing frustration that things are slowly moving. The White House is also starting to send some signals that it's getting impatient with Senators Sinema and Manchin, and that a deal needs to be reached very soon. President Biden is meeting with both progressives and moderates in 2 separate in-person meetings tomorrow to try to start to move both sides towards some sort of an agreement. And I think more and more members of Congress are really seeing that there needs to be a role for the president in trying to bridge the divide between among Democrats. We are still hearing that affordable housing and rental assistance in particular are among those that are most at risk of being either scaled back really significantly or cut entirely from the reconciliation package as they try to bring the overall size of it down from $3.5 trillion to somewhere around $2 trillion. Housing, of course, is just one of many programs that are on the chopping block, but it certainly has, I think, lit a fire under housing advocates and our champions on the Hill. Chairwoman Waters from House Financial Services Committee and Senate Banking Chairman Sherrod Brown have said that they're not going to accept any deal, meaning they won't vote for a deal, I assume, if it cuts housing investments more than other investments in the proposal. We've also seen a series of events and activity over the last week. Chairwoman Waters hosted a press event on Thursday where she and many members of Congress spoke about the need to keep housing investments in the bill. I also spoke at that press event and drove home the importance of the House campaign priorities. This week, NLHC President and CEO Diane Yantel and Nan Roman from the National Alliance to End Homelessness published an op-ed in The Hill. We'll share a link to it in the chat box, again, calling for housing investments and urging Congress to make use of this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to end homelessness in America. This week, we'll see another press conference from Chairwoman Waters and Sherrod Brown, Senator Brown. And later this week, Chairwoman Waters is hosting a hearing in House Financial Services Committee to make the case for why housing is central to all of the other priorities that are in the Build Back Better Act around climate change, healthcare, family security, and racial equity. We also saw an enormous amount of activity last week, and this is due in no small part to all of your advocacy on the ground. We saw just a tremendous amount of support for the 2 Dear Colleague letters that we had been working with Senator Merkley on and Representative Torres on. The Senate letter had 36 senators on it, which is really outstanding. Certainly a lot more than we initially thought might be on the letter. We were worried about how housing was going to compete with other priorities that these senators would have, but 36 senators on the letter is a really great showing, and thank you for all of your help on that. The House letter is even more amazing. 125 House members signed on to that Dear Colleague letter. The difference between the 2 letters, the Senate letter was much more broad, focused on the overall housing investments, which made it a little bit easier for us to get senators on board. The House letter is really targeted to the housing investments that all of us are pushing for, the $90 billion in rental assistance, $80 billion for public housing, and $37 billion for the Housing Trust Fund. So again, thank you guys so much for all of your work over the last week to get a really strong showing on both of those letters. We are hearing that housing advocates and our message is getting through, and that we have been very active and that they are hearing from both our champions and from us about the need for this. But we are nowhere near safe. We need to keep up this energy as we go forward, as negotiations go forward. So a couple of things that I think are really important for all of you to do. One is to thank your members of Congress for signing on to the Dear Colleague letters if they did. Oftentimes we make asks of our members of Congress, but we don't ever follow up with them and thank them for their role. You can either email them or thank them on social media by tagging them. That's a really important way of giving them credit for the work that they're doing to stand up for housing investments. The second thing you could do is find opportunities to engage with them again. I think that you could share that op-ed that Diane and Nan Roman wrote on how this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to end homelessness. You could tweet that at them, share it with their staff, use that as another tool to go back to their office and engage with them further. And that gets to my third point, which is all of the work we've been doing over the last couple of weeks has been encouraging members of Congress to weigh in directly with House and Senate leadership and the White House. That really needs to continue to be our #1 priority as these conversations continue. Those are the folks who are going to be in the room when decisions are made about what to fund and what not to fund. And they need to be hearing from their constituents, which are members of Congress. And the only way that happens is if we're really active and engaged in asking members to do that. So those are the top 3 things I think you could be doing this week. We will stay in touch with you as we hear more, as we learn more. And again, I just want to thank you for your quick action over the last couple of weeks as soon as we got word that housing investments were at risk. Just an incredible amount of advocacy on your part. And I think that's why we are hearing that our message is getting through and that we need to keep it up. So I'll turn it back to you, Paul.
Great, Sarah. Thank you so much. And really phenomenal work by everyone on the call and those beyond this call and Sarah and her team for getting that number of signatories onto those two dear colleague letters. Just phenomenal. Just to clarify, somebody did ask this question. The deadline for the dear colleague letters has not been extended from this morning, correct? At this point, additional signatories are not going to be added, right?
Yeah, that's the end of it. But if you wanted to reach out to your member of Congress because they weren't on the letter, you can certainly follow up with them and ask them why they didn't join. If they had concerns about it, use that as an opportunity to continue to engage with them. But yes, the deadline is over.
All right, very good. A lot of kudos. No other questions to ask you, so I'll let you go and get to your other thing. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Great, thank you.
Bye-bye. Okay, now we will go back to regularly scheduled program and have Joey Lindstrom, Director of Field Organizing at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, answer a question that we've gotten a number of times on these calls about lobbying by 501c3s. Joey?
Thank you, Paul. And yeah, this update will be pretty brief. We have heard some folks asking the question, we're with a nonprofit organization, and does advocacy impact our tax exempt status? And if you've been paying attention to these calls at all, and Sarah's update just a moment ago, one thing you've surely heard is that advocacy is working, and reaching out to your members of Congress is really putting us in a stronger position as the final provisions of the Build Back Better Act are being negotiated. So please know for certain that yes, policy advocacy, legislative advocacy is very much within your role as a 501c3 nonprofit. Indeed, advocacy is very important for you to do, and it's something that the clients that your service agency might serve or the community that you work within relies upon, because you have a unique and informed perspective that really carries weight in a lot of these conversations. And indeed, for many low-income people, if it's not you speaking up on these matters, their voice is left out of the process entirely. So I want to spend a moment just talking about, the safest way to do this, which I feel very comfortable saying all of you can do at basically no limits, is doing advocacy, which is talking to elected officials, talking to members of Congress about an upcoming important issue and informing them on how that issue impacts your community and the people that you serve, right? How will a proposed program and how will a proposed funding source really hit the ground in the community where you exist? Now, remember, and this is important, you're not actually lobbying until there is a bill introduced. So if you're going to your members of Congress and saying, we need to make sure that in the infrastructure package, there's money for housing to end homelessness, that actually isn't lobbying, because the bill, if you were doing it at that time, had not yet been introduced. Or if you were saying there's a need for a solution on people who can't use their vouchers because of voucher discrimination in our community. If you don't refer to a specific bill and how you think that member of Congress should or should not vote, you are still, in fact, not lobbying. It's only in an instance where you refer to a specific piece of legislation and you encourage the elected official to take a specific position on that legislation that you are, in fact, lobbying. So advocacy without lobbying is perfectly fine. Do it all day, do it as much as you want. Now, with lobbying, you can still do that, but there are limitations on your organizations if you are, in fact, 501c3. So when you're lobbying, the best indication is that as long as you don't spend more than 5% of your agency's time or money on lobbying, then you are safe. This is what's the insubstantial parts test, and it's sort of informally offered through guidance from the IRS, right? Very few of you, I can't imagine, would exceed 5% of your organization's time or money on lobbying purposes. And for that reason, you probably don't need to worry about tracking it. If you are worried that you might be exceeding that standard, that 5% standard, then there are additional options such as the 501h or perhaps creating a 501c4 and so forth. But I think most of you should feel comfortable that most of what you'll be doing will be informing elected officials more so than lobbying them. Because again, that lobbying standard is somewhat narrow, has to be a specific bill where you're urging a specific position. A final thing thing that I'll ask all of you to keep in mind is that you're lobbying not just when you talk to a member of Congress, you're also lobbying when you talk to their staff. And even further, you're lobbying when you do grassroots mobilization. This is what's called grassroots lobbying. So any time or money that you spend putting together a call to action that you send out to people in your community, urging them to reach out to their member of Congress, this is referred to as grassroots lobbying. And that time or those resources count against the overall 5% threshold established in the insubstantial part test. So this is something that we write about in our advocates guide. We have an article on lobbying for 501c3 nonprofits and for individuals. And I will put that article in the chat. I think it might be helpful for many of you who are on the call today. But other than that, Paul, I think that's my update.
Very good, Joey. Thank you very much. Let me see. Please send that article. I don't think there are any other questions for you right now, so just keep your eye out if you would. Thank you so much, sir. Okay, we will now move on to our next section of the agenda, which is to talk about emergency rental assistance spending tracking with Emma Foley.
Great.
Take it away, Emma.
Thanks, Paul. Today, I'll be providing an update on emergency rental assistance implementation and spending. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. NIHC has identified through tracking 500 Treasury emergency rental assistance programs that set up by state and local grantees. And while many programs are still working on spending down their ERA-1 for funds that were allocated by the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, 56 programs are now administering ERA-2 funds allocated by the American Rescue Plan. Programs have begun using ERA-2 funds in slightly different ways. Some programs have begun using ERA-2 funds at the same time as ERA-1 to reach households who might qualify for ERA-2 but not ERA-1. Programs might also use ERA-2 funds to extend the duration of assistance offered to households from 15 months to 18 months. Other programs have begun implementing ERA-2 after exhausting their full first tranche of ERA-1 funds. And finally, 6 programs that we're currently tracking are being implemented by grantees who did not previously administer ERA-1 funds, but elected to run their own programs for ERA-2. So that's something to look out for in localities where there may not have been ERA-1 funds, but are starting new programs with ERA-2. As more programs begin using their ERA-2 funds, NIHC will monitor important programmatic changes allowable under ERA-2. These include providing assistance for up to 18 months, opening eligibility to households that faced financial hardship during the pandemic rather than just due to the pandemic, and requiring that programs offer direct to tenant assistance when landlords refuse to participate. Next slide. Between the launch of emergency rental assistance in January and today, many administrators have made changes to enhance ERA programs, making them more flexible and accessible. These improvements are largely due to advocacy efforts and improved guidance issued by the U.S. Department of the Treasury. In late April, for example, only 27% of emergency rental assistance programs explicitly allowed self-attestation. But by October, over 59% of programs explicitly allowed for at least one type of self-attestation. The share of programs explicitly allowing payments directly to tenants has also increased from 15% in April to 29% in October. We expect this number to continue to increase given the ERA-2 requirements that programs offer direct to tenant assistance when landlords refuse to participate. Other flexibilities have also been implemented in response to updated guidance. For example, half of programs are now covering other housing expenses outside of direct financial assistance. This includes things like relocation costs, funding to pay for internet, and hotel motel fees. Over 1/5 of programs are also using categorical eligibility to help verify tenants' incomes, which decreases documentation burden for tenants. Only 3% of programs are implementing fact-specific proxies to determine income, but this is likely to also increase because this process is still fairly new for many administrators. And detailed information for all 500 emergency rental assistance programs can be found on our program dashboard and detailed program database, which is linked at the bottom of the slide. Next slide. As a general update, NLIHC is now tracking over $10.6 billion that has been paid or approved to households as a part of Treasury's emergency rental assistance program. And this represents approximately 43% of the initial $25 billion ERA1 allocation. Next slide. And ERA programs continue to spend down their funding at very different rates. And this graph represents the 15 highest spending and 15 lowest spending state emergency rental assistance programs. This data represents just expenditures, not obligations, and subtracts 10% of the allocation total to account for administrative expenses. According to this data, Illinois, New Jersey, Texas, the District of Columbia, and New York have all spent over 3/4 of their ERA1 funding. Several states have also spent significant amounts just in the last month, including Connecticut and North Carolina. Other states have continued to spend very little, and several of these states are particularly concerning given their high number of low-income renters, such as Tennessee, Florida, Georgia, and Arizona. It's critical that programs continue to implement flexibilities, increase outreach efforts, and offer application assistance to get funds to those who need it. Given the wide array of states that are spending down their funding successfully, from large states like New York to Virginia, to Alaska, to Oregon, and others, it's clear that emergency rental assistance can efficiently be dispersed across diverse settings. Programs struggling to spend down their money should look to best practices and innovations in these states and localities where the funding is getting out quickly to increase efficiency and reach more renters. Next slide. In terms of what's on the horizon for emergency rental assistance, we anticipate that updated spending data for all ERA programs will be released sometime later this week or next week. This data will include spending data through September, and it represents an important milestone because the Department of Treasury will use this data to begin the reallocation process. We provided an overview of what we know about reallocation so far on last week's call, but I've gone ahead and linked here reallocation guidance from Treasury as well as NLIHC's overview with additional details. Next slide. And lastly, we provide more detailed spending data for state programs and for programs with dashboards at bit.ly/ERA-spending. And you can feel free to reach out to us at research@nlihc.org with any questions or updated data. Thanks.
Thank you, Emma. A couple of questions that have come in. One is, how can I find my county spending of ERA, specifically my county?
Great question. We don't publish data for every single program that we have, and so there's state data and data for programs with dashboards on our Google Sheet. If you want to look at your specific city or county, Treasury does publish that data on their emergency rental assistance website in a downloadable Excel file, and I can post a link to that website in the chat and include it in a follow-up email.
Great. Another, Joseph Meisner asked, do you know renters who were eligible for ERA but who could not get that assistance and wound up being evicted? Is there a way to halt an eviction until the renter has had time to apply for ERA?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's very location specific, and so several states and localities have pretty extensive either eviction diversion programs or programs where renters who are at risk of eviction do have time to apply for rental assistance and receive that funding before an eviction occurs. We're tracking some of that data internally, and so maybe on a future call we could share what we know about those programs, but it is kind of on a local basis.
Okay. Another question here is, one of the big problems we have with our community, this is an anonymous attendee, is with our community action agencies who distribute ERA money. Is there fear of fraud if they relax their requirements and will be liable for the fraud? Why do some agencies not worry about such things?
Yeah, that's also a good question. I'm not so sure about kind of, there's certainly different levels of concerns about fraud across programs. I think dependent on a variety of factors, but I think what an important point here is that the Department of Treasury and White House has been very clear in that they're really encouraging these flexibilities, and that reallocation also will occur if places are not implementing some of these flexibilities. And so I think that, the federal departments have made clear that these are very important to implement. We are still in an emergency, and these flexibilities help get funds more quickly to those who need it. And so I think in terms of advocacy efforts, I would point to that very strong language from Department of Treasury and the White House about implementing those flexibilities.
Great, Emma. I'll note that Jerry asked a question, or made a point maybe, about the party leadership of the states that are on the shame list, as he calls it. I don't think we'll go there. But there's a question here. Do you know how to access data related to ERA 1 and 2 obligated funds in addition to expenditures? Is this only available through Treasury?
Yeah, so some places do report the obligated funds on their dashboards, and I should note that the majority of state programs do have dashboards at this point, and so some of that data is posted there. The only other comprehensive source would be the Department of Treasury. That hasn't been included in the public data that they've released yet, but grantees are expected to submit more detailed data for the end of the third quarter at the end of this month. And so it's possible that in coming data releases, we have that information as well.
Very good. Thank you so much, Emma. And I want to move on now just to a couple of comments to close out the call. Number one, please, please, please take all the steps that Sarah was pointing out, that we need to keep the pressure on as much as possible in the next few weeks. It's critically important. I also wanted to share with you that NLIC has put together a new podcast called The Home Front. And the first episode is now available, which shares a behind the scenes look into the advocacy work of the National Low Income Housing Coalition on the Build Back Better Act. I think you'll really enjoy it. I'm gonna ask May or one of my other partners to please put a link into the chat box so that you can see how to access that podcast. But I think you'll really enjoy it. There'll be others that will be coming, but this is the very first one, and we'd love for you to check it out. So thank you all for participating in today's call. Thank you to all of our panelists. Every single one of them was fantastic. And we will see you next week on the national call. Have a great week, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.